make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects, and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Aina, keeping it non-controversial. Welcome to episode 53. Today we're going to be discussing the Hindu far right. I've got Ravi here with me, and Ravi is someone I've known online for several years. He's an Indian immigrant to the U.S., an atheist, familiar with the horrendous directions online movement atheism has taken, and someone generally in the know about the Western, alt, and far right, all of which puts him in a good position to comment on, compare, and contrast both far-right movements and how they're rooted in extreme anti-Muslim sentiment. Hi, Ravi. How's it going?
Hey, Aina. How's it going?
Good.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on. And also, I forgot to mention, you're a vegan too, so that will be interesting.
Yes, let's get that out of the way right at the start.
Yeah, okay, guys, I had to have this vegan on, so... No, I say it'll be interesting because of all the beef conversations we'll be having.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, the reason I came to you for this is because I see you commenting on the Hindu far right a lot online, and there's some interesting dynamics which overlap with the alt-right from what I can tell. I mean, recently I saw this person tweet about how Hindus need to do their dharmic duty of reproducing more so as to not get overtaken by the Muslim birth rate, which is totally like, the white genocide bullshit you hear all the time.
Yeah, that's it's a really, really common talking point. It's part of this whole narrative that, again, you see on the far right as well, this feeling of constantly being under siege, even though you're overwhelmingly the majority and no one really poses any threat to you. So, yeah, there's a lot of talk about birth rates, about how the Muslims are reproducing really fast and the Hindus are not, and how they're going to be overtaken and how they're going to be, subjects of a Muslim ruler again, and that whole, the usual stuff. It's just the same thing, but Hindus saying it, so...
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me, interesting and depressing to see, fellow brown people spouting white genocide bullshit, and it's sad because when I wasn't familiar with the Indian right, which I am now because online, boy, do they ever come for you.
Oh, yeah. I think they might actually be the worst of like all of the far right Twitter, hellscape regions of the internet. I think like of all my encounters, they've been by far the worst.
Yeah,
that may just be me. I don't know.
They're definitely worse than Islamists because I think Islamists are not as organized and as savvy or polished in their rhetoric, so they won't entrap you in longer conversations. You'll see someone saying something stupid in Islamist and you'll be like, mute, block, idiot. And there'll be like 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah. I've noticed that the Hindu Nationalists, again, of all the sort of far right movements online, they always tend to attack in like huge numbers. So
huge, and they have these massive accounts as well.
Yeah.
When you get quote tweeted, and then you're screwed.
Yeah. And what you were saying about the polished, the more polished people is usually a mix though. So there's like one polished guy and then 50 people just tweeting incoherent stuff.
Really?
Yeah. So it's like, it's a mix of both. But I've like, just in terms of strength and numbers, they seem to be worse than even the alt-right. But
yeah,
that's just my experience.
I guess being of Muslim background in the West, I encounter alt-right trolls and far-right trolls, speaking about Islam especially, online more than I do like Hindu far-right trolls, but I have encountered them. So I can't really gauge what's worse, but I have seen that once they come at you, oh my gosh, It's like never ending. And you know what's really weird is that they often are like, oh, well, I'm an atheist too. And they like adopt these like terrible talking points from like the online movement atheism stuff. They're often fans of Sam Harris, and
Right.
it's so bizarre.
Yeah, they're fans of all these people to the extent that they can borrow their talking points as something to use against Muslims. So the minute Sam Harris says something, derogatory about Hindus or Hinduism, they're going to denounce him.
Which he doesn't often do.
Yeah, I don't think. He probably has some or the other, but definitely not as much as Islam. So
yeah.
So that's so they it's understandable that they have no problem with people like Sam Harris, but so the more militant Indians or atheists they would hate a lot more. So because they tend to focus on Hinduism as well.
Yeah, but like atheists who are actually like,
Right.
secularists and not Hindu nationalists. So describe to
Right.
me this phenomenon of Hindu atheist that's like very rooted in Hindu identity.
Right. So I guess that's one of the things about Hindu identity is that it was never primarily or entirely a religious identity. It's always been a sort of ethno-cultural identity as well. So, just to take my example, growing up, I was never religious in the sense that I didn't have any beliefs about gods or supernatural agents or any of that. But growing up, if you'd asked me what my religion was or, what I identified as, I would have just said Hindu without thinking.
Yeah.
Because it was more of an ethnic identity than anything else. It's sort of like Jewish, but, I don't want to push the parallels too much, but there's some similarities there. So it's really not surprising that, there's a lot of atheists who are quite happy to call themselves Hindu nationalists because they perceive it as a sort of ethnic identity as well. It's not about religion. It's not about theology. So a lot of people, when they think about Hindu nationalism, they think it's like, evangelical Christianity or, like very ultra religious groups in the West. But that's not really a good comparison. So a better comparison, like you said, would be the alt-right. It's much more of a sort of blood and soil nationalist movement than a sort of theology-based movement.
Right. Even though there are some like secondary texts and stuff that I've read that have some pretty terrible caste-related, bigoted prescriptions in them.
Oh, the Manusmriti.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So that's one of many, many, many secondary texts, and you'll find lots of just outright horrifying stuff about caste and women and all of that. And what Hindu nationalists do is they'll say something like, well, at least this is what I've seen. They'll say something like, well, we don't actually believe this stuff and we don't think we should follow it, but it was still progressive for its time and it was better than anything else that existed for its time, so we should still be proud of it, or something like that.
Right. Like I've heard Muslims say the same as well.
Yeah, that's a fairly common defense. So they feel the need to sort of reflexively defend anything that's part of their Hindu identity and culture, no matter how outrageous it is. And they know it's ridiculous, but they kind of have to engage in these mental gymnastics just to preserve that sense of identity.
And it's interesting because the same charitableness isn't afforded to Muslims defending the secondary text of the Hadith, for example, which are awful as well. But
yeah, those are categorically just beyond the pale and can't be defended under any circumstances. But when it comes to these texts, you have to be like really nuanced and look at the context and all of that.
And also they'll say like, but it's not the main text, it's the secondary text. I'm like, yeah, but so are Hadiths.
Right, yeah.
So, I never know enough about Hindu scripture to really get into it with them, but I did notice this.
Yeah, and the problem with discussing Hindu scripture or even Hinduism as a religion is that there really is no such thing as a unified religious community that you can call a Hindu community. And especially, you're beginning to see some of that now, but at least historically there was no unified religious community. And especially for lay people, the kinds of practices they were involved in and the ritual ceremonies they took part in, the gods they worshipped, none of that was really rooted in some sort of universal sort of legalistic text. It was always based in very sort of parochial traditions and customs handed down, over generations. So
and that's hard for Abrahamic like me to kind of wrap my mind around fully,
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because there's actually been a lot of recent work in the sociology and anthropology of religion that says that we probably shouldn't even apply the category of religion to these pre-modern, especially pre-modern pagan societies. I mean, of course, it depends on how you define religion. You can define it in a way that applies to them. But our everyday usage of the term is so caught up with all these connotations that are very specific to a sort of, post-Reformation, Protestant, Abrahamic and later Enlightenment ideas of what a religious community is, that don't really map on to how pre-modern, especially pagan societies actually worked. I mean, it's not just India. It's true of Japan and Africa, and even like pre-Christian Greece. Their sort of cults and their whole set of traditions, they're not religions in the same way that Christianity and Islam and Judaism are religions. Now, this is not to say that texts didn't matter to anyone. There's usually a small class or caste of philosophers, theologians, scholars, monks, and their whole life is organized around scriptural exegesis and doctrine and very narrow sectarian identities. And for them, texts and doctrine and theology matter a great deal. But for most people and lay people, they didn't have that sort of text-based understanding of how to operate in the world, and they didn't have like rigid, exclusivist religious identities either. It was a lot more fluid and fuzzy.
Which is why you don't see probably the kind of violent sectarianism that you do, like in Islam, for example, right?
You mean between different like sub schools of the tradition? Yeah. There are, a few incidents that have been recorded, but again, since it was this sort of entirely text-based understanding was limited to a small cast of people, you won't see widespread sort of religious violence of that sort. You'll see other sorts of violence. You'll see like caste violence and ethnic violence and stuff like that. But yeah. And the interesting thing is that this was even true of, Muslims and Christians in sort of pre-modern India, is even when they adopted, a set of practices that would mark them out as a specific community. So, for example, if you're a Muslim, you might have a specific way, you'd have specific cultural markers associated with that, right? So you'd dress a certain way, perform some kinds of worship, maybe avoiding certain kinds of food like pork. That would set you out as a specific community. But even after adopting those practices, it doesn't mean necessarily that you get rid of your previous practices. So you might still participate in a whole bunch of quote-unquote pagan rituals.
Pakistani weddings are a great example of that, right? Like we have so much like that borrowed from our Hindu roots. I'm sure I'll piss a lot of people off just by saying that. But
exactly. Yes, and if you look at like the seasonal rituals that usually happen at a village level, or a great example of this historically, and there's lots of records of this, these seasonal offerings to the gods, usually those involve the entire village community, so every caste involved has some sort of role to play in the ritual. And at the end of the ritual, they're also rewarded with whether it's usually food or money or some sort of token of acknowledgement that you performed your services as part of this this ritual offering. And of course, how important and how privileged your role was in these services depended on your caste, where you were in the caste hierarchy. But the interesting thing is that Muslims and Christians, or people we would today recognize as Muslims and Christians, had roles to play as well, and they were awarded at the end of the ceremony as well. So this idea of sort of exclusivist religious identities is a very modern phenomenon. And there's like, if you look at the British records where they're trying to classify people into these neat boxes, lay people especially, you can see that they're really annoyed that they're not able to do it, because there's no real line. But you can't really say, well, these people, Hindu or Muslim or Sikh. There's just, a syncretic mix of practices. And ends up being pretty arbitrary, really. And that, in fact, that actually heightens, later on, sort of ethnic and religious conflicts.
What does? Sorry, the lack of classification,
or the sort of imposing these classifications and exclusive identities when they weren't there before. That actually, made it easier for these sectarian conflicts to.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, even now, like there's tension at Pakistani weddings, especially now, actually after the whole, Saudi Arabia indoctrinating Pakistan thing. as we try to, like some of us try to be holier than thou, more Muslim than thou, they're like rejecting the more colorful and fun parts of Pakistani weddings, the rituals that are taken from Indian roots, and, you know, trying to be more Arab when our roots aren't Arab.
Right. It's this whole idea of purifying your whole, you know, your practices and getting rid of any pagan influences. And interestingly, we have the exact reverse going on in India right now, where any sort of signs of Islamic influence people are trying to remove those. So
and which brings me to a topic I really wanted to discuss with you: how the Taj Mahal is being politicized and not getting funding and going to waste away because some people view it as, you know, too Muslim to look after, even though it brings in tourist money and stuff like that. And then there's the whole, they want to change Muslim city names in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is also very sad and depressing.
Yeah, this is, it's really what their whole end game is, right? Is to get rid of any sign of, because you have to think of it from their point of view to really understand what they're trying to do here. For them, any Muslim symbolism, so they consider, you know, all those years when the ruling class was predominantly Muslim, they think that whole period was just a period of like humiliation and slavery, and Hindus were just treated like, you know, garbage. And that whole period is something that we need to forget about, move forward from, and so we need to get rid of any sign of, you know, that influence as far as possible. And of course, you know, once we actually consolidate power, you know, we either ethnically cleanse the Muslims or make them some sort of second-class citizens, blah blah blah. But yeah, it's you know, it's really sad, but it's not surprising. It's exactly what you'd expect them to do. And, you know, now that they have a Hindu nationalist, they have a Hindu nationalist prime minister, nothing's going to stop them from trying.
Yay. Yeah, but it's so sad that that's the level that hate can go to, that you take one of the most, you know, recognizable monuments and just let it go to waste, just not give a shit about it, just because sometime historically, long ago, it was, you know, Muslim.
Right. And if you notice, they usually make up stories about how, there was originally a Hindu temple there that was demolished and replaced.
Oh, no, I haven't heard that.
They do that for like every monument, you know. They just make, like, I mean, so this practice of building monuments on top of previously existing structures is, you know, that's something that has been recorded. Yeah. But with these people, it's like any, you know, Muslim monument that you pick, they'll like pull the story from nowhere about how, it was actually a temple that the invading Muslims destroyed, and then they built this Muslim thing on top of it. So that's, you know, that's like an additional justification. We're not destroying, we're just trying to take it back to the way it was initially, so we're entirely justified.
Oh dear.
That's really, really common. I don't think they've actually talked about destroying the Taj Mahal yet.
No, so but what I'm saying is they don't give it funding and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Wither and waste when it's.
But like I wouldn't be surprised if you'll find at least like a bunch of people say that, there was actually a temple there, or they might even say that it was originally a temple, or like just weird stuff like that makes no sense. But it's like it's standard, sort of a standard Hindu nationalist. Talking point.
I mean, I've heard, like, you know, Islamists talk about destroying temples in Pakistan, whatever is left, and it's so. I cannot understand for the life of me, because to me all of that is part of my history, you know, and all the different pieces, even, you know, colonial British buildings. There's some really beautiful ones, which is unfortunate they aren't being looked after as well as they could be, you know, if they were in a wealthier country.
Yeah. It's really sad because they refuse to see anything that doesn't fit their sort of narrow understanding of what's Indian or indigenous is something that has to be purged. They can't look at history as this, you know, broader picture of different people interacting in different ways, and some of it was violent, some of it was unfortunate, but not all of it was, and there was lots of good stuff, and plenty of good things came out of the interactions as well. But
oh boy, you're gonna get attacked. No, yeah. But we're not. We're not saying who you are, so
yeah.
You won't get attacked on Twitter then. I will.
Oh well, but you will. So
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Why can't I just do like podcasts about non-controversial stuff?
I mean, you promised your father you wouldn't, so.
I know. Every week I promise him. It just doesn't work out somehow. He knows me, so he wouldn't be too surprised. He says the same stuff about my art. He's like, why don't you paint landscapes and flowers? What is this weird shit?
Well, but at least we can test my hypothesis that they're the worst of the worst in terms of social media. So you can tell me if you're, once you actually air this, if your experience with them is, better or worse than with the others.
Oh yeah. Oh, I look forward to that.
It's a nice social experiment that we can conduct here.
But yeah, okay, so tell me more about the roots of the Hindu far right and its attraction to Western fascishness and the love for Hitler and Nazism.
Yeah, I think it would help to actually understand the Hindu identity itself, because you can't really understand Hindu nationalism without it. So we know that Hindu was not was a geographic term initially. It just meant people who live in and around the Indus River, right? That's all it meant initially, and it was never a label anyone self-identified as. And then over time, especially under Muslim rule, and with certain Christian missionaries, they start using the term Hindu just to mean pagan Indian people, basically. So anyone who's not Muslim, not Christian, is in India is Hindu. It's just this ethnic label or cultural label at that point. And then in the medieval period, you start seeing a few instances of people self-identifying as Hindus, usually as setting up the Muslims as the other. It's about, we've been conquered, we're going to reconquer our holy lands and consecrate our shrines and all of that. So you see like a few instances of Sanskrit texts and the like where people actually identify as Hindu. But again, like I said earlier, it's important to remember that what's in the text doesn't actually reflect what the vast majority of people think and feel, because again, these texts are monopolized by a very narrow cast of people. And then so that happens, and then in the 19th century, you have what emerges as a reform movement it's mostly a class of intellectuals at this point. So what they're trying to do is they see themselves as fighting back against a mostly Christian onslaught at this point, because it's the colonial period. You have Christian missionaries pointing out that Hinduism is idolatrous. It's there's all this pagan stuff, there's superstition, blah blah blah. So they respond by consolidating a sort of new Hindu identity, which is based on, they cherry pick a few texts and say these texts represent Hinduism. And if you actually look at these texts, they preach the same things as, the Abrahamic religions preach. So they preach, monotheism, they preach no idolatry, stuff like that. So it's obviously
they're trying to me always the, this is idolatry crowd when they kneel at a statue of Jesus, or they, go round and round black box and say it's not, this is all anti-idolatry, and it's like, have you seen yourself lately?
Yeah. It's it's always, idolatry is always conveniently defined as something the other person does.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, so you see this, it's very clear that there's this new identity being constructed as a response to the challenge they're facing from what they see as Christian missionaries. But it's still, so you see the beginnings of people self-identifying as Hindus and, trying to create this new religious identity. And it's it picks up. So that's like a sort of proto-Hindu nationalist phase. I'd say this is like the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. And the beginnings of what we would today recognize as Hindu nationalism, it can largely be traced back, I'd say So there was this guy called Vinayak Savarkar. He was, interestingly, he was initially a sort of militant anti-colonial sort of revolutionary. He was involved in like bomb throwing and stuff like that, for which he was arrested by the British. And when he was in prison, he noticed a lot of things that he did not like. So he saw the rise of Muslim nationalism, especially during the First World War.
But he was throwing bombs before that.
Yeah, he was throwing bombs before that. He was trying to liberate India, all of that, and then the British threw him in prison. And that's where he writes this text where that's the text that defines Hindutva, which means Hinduness, which is like the founding text of Hindu nationalism. And he's bothered by the rise of Muslim nationalism as well. So around the term of the First World War, when the Caliph, the Ottoman Caliph, was abolished by the British, there were widespread protests among Muslims in India. It was called the Khilafat movement, and he took this as evidence that Muslims are not loyal to India. They're like this fifth column. They're serving foreign interests, and if we let them have any power, we're gonna go back to all those centuries of slavery we suffered under Muslim rule. So the priority here is defining, the Hindu identity, consolidating power, and ethnically cleansing Muslims. He's very open about this.
Nice. I appreciate when they're open.
Yeah. So there's, and he was like you said, he was an open admirer of, of fascism in Europe. He saw that as a model to follow in India. He praises, Hitler and Mussolini, and not just him, the other Hindu nationalists after him as well. And the interesting thing about Savarkar, the guy who wrote this founding text, is he himself was not religious at all. He was in fact, I think he even declares himself an atheist in that text. He was an atheist, I'm pretty sure. He thinks that the caste system should be abolished because it's something that's dividing Hindus. So they need to get rid of these sort of feudal divisions and come together as a modern nation state. Again, nationalism, of course, is a very recent thing that was, again, in South Asia, it was very, very recent. Most people didn't have a national identity at all. So he's trying very hard to construct one. So he thinks, we have to get rid of caste because it's dividing us and preventing us from forming a nation. We have to get rid of, a lot of the superstition. He doesn't even have he's even pro eating beef. So he thinks all of that is good. So again, for him, it's very clear that Hindu is an ethnic identity. And Hindu for him is just anyone who's a descendant of the original inhabitants of India.
So there is a purity element to it. Yeah,
it's it's a racial purity, blood and soil, that kind of thing. So the thing is, he defines any tradition that had its origins outside India as foreign and the other, and has to be gotten rid of. So it's mainly Muslims and Christians, but again, mainly Muslims because they're a larger population. So that's kind of his whole. That's like the founding. That's when the founding ideology of Hindu nationalism is put on paper. And it was circulated pretty widely while he was still in prison. And then you see the beginnings of Hindu nationalist organizations like the RSS, which right now functions as a sort of paramilitary wing of the BJP, which is the political party, and the RSS,
which are in power.
Right, which are in power. They came to power in 2014, and the RSS again were clearly inspired by the black shirts in the fascist paramilitary wings as well, and they modeled themselves after that. And all of this is entirely open for everyone to see. So, and recently Modi actually had this event where he honored Savarkar as a great hero. Wow. That's these people aren't like fringe historical figures that no one really knows about. They're idolized today by most Hindu nationalists, and
these are like open ethnic cleansing advocates and stuff.
Yeah, open fascists. There's literally passages where he praises what Hitler does to the Jews and says this is the model we have to follow here in India. This is what we have to do as well.
Yeah. And someone said that after Modi became chief minister of Gujarat, they rewrote texts, Modi, who's the prime minister now, to make Nazis look like at least redeemable.
It's entirely possible. I've heard that Mein Kampf is actually pretty sells a lot of copies in India still.
Wow.
So these guys are again have no problem with being pretty open about that stuff. So the more polished ones, the more sophisticated ones will try to distance themselves from that because they know that they'll lose credibility to a Western audience. If they're open about it. But
it's the Richard Spencer tactic, right? Don't be too open.
Exactly.
Don't let them know your power levels or your desire for genocide. And polish all this and sell it.
Right. Yeah. Well, so there's the polished front of upper class, upper caste, well-educated corporate types who are like very, they very sophisticated. They very often you'll see them like appropriate, pardon the pun, social justice, like woke language, where they talk about how Muslims and others are like culturally appropriating Hindu traditions, and you see a lot of that. So any Muslims or Christians display any syncretism or adopt any sort of iconography or anything from Hindu traditions, which is
so like what's an example?
So if they have like art, Christian art that's based on like Hindu art styles, traditional Hindu art styles, or songs about Jesus set to like the form of traditional Indian classical music.
But wouldn't Indian Christians want to blend something like that anyway? Like isn't that like a natural response if you're both Indian and Christian to kind of
exactly
create something like that?
And they've been doing that the whole time. They're like really, really ancient Christian communities in India who, if you look at their actual rituals and their customs, are almost indistinguishable from what we would consider Hindu rituals in a lot of ways. But again, so these guys are like, oh no, that's cultural appropriation. You can't do that, and and stuff like that. So there's a lot of these sophisticated people or use a lot of that language.
That's interesting.
Sort of, any criticism they receive, if you're white, they're going to call you racist. They'll call you Orientalist. So they use all of that post-colonial, scholarship, that kind of jargon to as a weapon, while at the same time, what they're putting forward is an openly fascist vision of what India should be.
Wow.
So there's this weird space they're in where they're they take what they can from like left wing and woke language, but what they're actually for is the most reactionary stuff ever. So
see, I don't know about this thing's roots or desires for fascism, but I saw a recent piece saying like why straight white men hate astrology or something like that. Like I think it was Vice or something. It was so terrible. Painful. It's like, why are you turning this into some form of racism to object to nonsense?
Yeah,
like,
I actually read that piece, and the amazing thing about it, is that it's all for all its woke pretensions. What it ends up saying basically is that, well, men are more rational and women are more emotional, and astrology is an emotional thing, and that's why men don't like it, which is sexist. That's basically the argument. Obviously,
oh man! So was that written by one of these?
That's not too far.
Was that written by one of these woke?
A woke Hindu nationalist?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it was just like probably just like a woke white person. I'm not sure.
Clueless person.
One of those. But I wouldn't be surprised if a Hindu nationalist wrote something like that. They're all up in arms about yoga. So that's, again, I know we don't like to, like, the whole horseshoe theory thing is kind of overdone, but like the really like ridiculous woke types who would think that, yoga, any Westerner doing yoga is cultural appropriation or whatever. The Hindu nationalists say the same thing.
Oh.
And they borrow all of that. They borrow all of that rhetoric and say, hey, you can't do this. This is our cultural heritage, and you're appropriating, you're defiling it with your sort of arrogant Westerner privilege and all of that. So it's really interesting how they adapt to like changing political situations.
Yeah, it really is interesting and frightening because the whole Islamist MRA thing is also a thing, and
Oh yeah, yeah. And I'm sure there's a lot of Hindu MRAs as well, and fans of people like Jordan Peterson and stuff like that. So
yeah, and they appropriate the anti-SJW rhetoric, like, you know, who wants a feminist Muslima? You know, we want our, like, you know, non-feminist Muslimas. It's just, these people are just SJWs ruining, you know, our traditional Islamic marriages and blah, blah, blah. It's such garbage. And it's, you know, what's really interesting is that the dynamic that I see as an outside observer all the way from the West in India between the left and right is very similar to the dynamic I see between the left and right here in the West, because the left, I guess, tends to be then softer on Islam and overprotective, and sometimes gloss over and glamorize some really silly stuff, you know, that you really shouldn't be apologizing for. But because of the viciousness of the Hindu far right types, it just tends to happen that way.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's exactly the same thing. So the understandable intention here is, you know, we want they're a minority here. They're at the risk of, you know, they're a marginalized group, Muslims, that is. They face violence. They face threats. So yes, we want to be extra cautious, in, you know, when we're talking about them here. And unfortunately, at times it does happen that they, you know, gloss over, you know, reactionary interpretations of Islam or practices that they really should be calling out, but they don't, because they're afraid that any criticism will give cover to the sort of Hindu nationalist.
And it kind of does. Like, it's hard.
It does. Yeah. That's
as someone who likes to engage in thoughtful and legit, fair criticism of Islam, it's a problem that I don't know how to get around in this climate, especially, right? Like, how do you criticize it and also not empower or embolden these types? Seems impossible. Yeah, and I don't really have an answer. Like, the solution is obviously not to just shut up and not say anything about. You but just at the same time, caveat everything.
Yeah.
No, not for you guys. Get out of here, bigots and racists.
Yeah, it just makes the whole project of legitimate criticism that much more exhausting. That's like the takeaway I have, is like, you can still do it, you just have to like throw in a billion caveats with every paragraph. So
it works ultimately against their own ends that they desire, right? Like, if they hijack every single criticism with their fashy nonsense, then less people in the mainstream will criticize, and things are not going to change or resonate because people will hold back.
Right. Well, but then what they'll say is, look, the mainstream, the left is soft on Islam. They're not going to point any of this out. So we're the only ones doing it. So you have to follow us. So it's like both. Either way, you're kind of trapped, because if you do say something, then they're going to just say, see, even the leftists are saying it, so we're right.
Yeah.
And if you don't say anything, they're going to say, aha, see, they're not saying anything. That means they're trying to protect like Islamists. So, you know, you have to put your faith in this.
Yeah, I mean,
so
I've had my run-ins with the Indian left too, and it's really unfortunate because I think we agree on most things. But, you know, when they go around saying stuff like Malala was shot in the head because of white supremacy, and I'm like, clearly no. I mean, fuck, she was shot in the head by Islamists because she wanted an education for girls. And then they somehow try to like twist it into that and then make me out to be like this evil Islamophobe for just saying that. It gets very, very frustrating for me. And one time I did this week-long stint on a popular Indian rotation account. I forget what it's called, Gender Log.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember that, yeah.
And, oh my God, I think it made, like, record-breaking, like, hate tweet numbers. Because first, I came in and the Indian right was like, oh, look at this porky pig, whatever. Like, they thought they could, like, get to me by calling me a pig because they assumed I was a Muslim or whatever.
Right.
And why are you letting a pecky...
Porkistan.
That's right. Right. Oh, I'm so offended. So then I was like, yeah, you know what? Those insults don't work on me, guys. Like, I have nothing against pork or pigs, or I'm not even a practicing Muslim. I've left Islam, so go at it. Then I started talking about my feelings about hijab and niqab, and boy, did I get it from the Indian left. Like, they called me a UKIPper and all kind of shit. Like, it's like, how do you not know the difference between a woman raised in that saying that this shouldn't continue because, I really suffered under it, and an external sort of bigoted person who doesn't like things too different from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's just an unfortunate consequence of wokeness where at some point people just can't distinguish between legitimate criticism and actual bigotry.
And it doesn't help that there's tokenizing now, right? Like, there's ex-Muslims that are there for actual bigotry. They are 100% down with that as long as it gets them views, retweets, whatever. So people hear ex-Muslim and they're like, oh, God.
Right. Yeah. You can't even say, hey, guys, I was actually raised, in the faith, and I think I have a perspective here that you guys might be interested in. But if you say that, they're going to think that, they're just one of the ex-Muslims who we all know have been allied with the most reactionary aspects of of the West here. So
the West, and also the Hindu right,
and India. Yeah. People like I don't know if we want to name names here, but people like Tariq Fatah.
Yeah, let's name those names.
And the totally legit Imam. I keep forgetting his last name.
Imam Tawhidi, Imam of Peace. What a sweet and peaceful guy who goes on white nationalist podcasts to talk about how violent interpretations of Islam are the most common, most legit, and everyone's interpreting it like that.
Right. Yeah. Extremely, extremely real Imam right there. No suspicions at all.
None. He also posts pictures in a church and says how he's truly at peace all of a sudden. It's like, dude, what are you doing, you idiot?
Yeah. But he has huge, I've noticed that he has huge fan followings in India as well. Yeah. Among the Hindu nationalists. And Tariq Fatah, of course, and I'm sure there's others, and these are just the names that popped in my head.
Yeah, and that guy, Tariq, he has been trying to get, it seems, Indian nationality for so long. Why? It's not happening for him. Oh.
Does he really think that, when it comes down to it, they're going to treat him any better? I don't know.
It's really funny because both these guys that you've mentioned have a weird double standard about how Muslims should tolerate, blasphemy and things like that. I think everyone should deal with it. Sure. But when it comes down to eating beef, then Muslims are the ones that should compromise. Right.
Yeah. I've noticed that as well. It's why can't they just, this is just one restriction. Why can't they just, compromise and, give in here?
Yeah.
But he'd never say that about, if you say that about, and say, well, why can't they just not draw cartoons of the Prophet? He's going to call you,
an apologist.
SJW, apologist, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an Imam of Peace. I'm looking right now at a tweet of his when, from May this year, when there was a Muslim lynched over suspicion of, slaughtering a cow. Imam has this to say. He says, a mufti in Mecca will issue a fatwa to kill non-Muslims, but won't issue a fatwa to stop killing cows, even though it could save the lives of many Muslims in certain parts of the world, because terrorists pay good money and cows don't.
So the fact that they're getting lynched is now the blame is not on the people who are doing the lynching, but at least people who won't issue the fatwas.
Yeah,
that's
anti-beef fatwas.
Brilliant.
It's just absurd to me how you can literally justify hate crimes by saying Muslims should be ruling that beef is no longer permissible to appease Hindu terrorists.
Yeah, why can't you just flip that around and say, well, why would you draw? Well, if you really cared, you wouldn't publish cartoons of the Prophet because it would get
it would save so many lives, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just
Yeah, and it's absurd to me how many in movement atheism do not see through these people because they're so blinded by their ideology of anti-Islam that they actually find these people credible critics. Oh, what a refreshing imam. Oh, what a great truth speaker. It's no, if he said the same shit, just about blasphemy, you would see through that in a second.
Yeah. It's like this, they, correctly identify that some people on the left will not accept any criticism of Islam. And they've basically just, their reaction to that is to say that any criticism of Islam is justified, no matter how bigoted or racist or whatever. There's no rational center between the two extremes.
Right. There's no, humanist principles in play here. It's just anti-Islam.
Right.
Which ties in all of these far-right actors, from different parts of the world, and how they capitalize on those talking points, on those token imams and token Muslims. Tariq Fatah was praising 14 words reciting Faith Goldie, who was running for mayor.
Jesus Christ.
Like,
I mean, yeah. But the funny thing is that you'll see Hindu nationalists do that all the time. They'll like retweet and like boost like the most like obviously racist like conspiracy theories about Muslim immigration and stuff like that. And like just like, I mean, of course it's morally abhorrent, but like I can't help but think like just from a self-interested point of view, like that's going to hurt other brown people too.
Exactly,
know that, right?
Right?
I don't know.
And what happens once they've managed to successfully, fully dehumanize Muslims? Who do you think is next?
Right, exactly. Yeah. If you think they're going to stop there, you're just, yeah.
Yeah. For anyone listening, if you catch the odd jingling coming from Ravi, it's because he's secretly Santa's assistant.
Yes.
And
Santa has diversity programs now, so I got
oh, no!
The white North Pole is brown now. Sorry,
Cultural Marxism is fucking with Santa.
Yeah, we white genocided the elves. Sorry.
Oh dear. Also, maybe you can speak to like sort of the mimicking of the American or Western right. Like someone was telling me that the Hindu right has started like this whole fake war on Diwali narrative, and so they just take a page out of that playbook. And
right, yeah, this I think is more recent. I haven't been following it too closely, but I think my understanding is that what they're annoyed about is restrictions on fireworks, right? Because it's let's be honest, it's a huge pain.
So firstly, let's just say what Diwali is in case someone doesn't know.
Right, so it's a very popular Hindu festival celebrated in almost all of India.
Where Trump forgot to mention the Hindus. Did you see that tweet? He was like,
yeah, and I was waiting for all the Hindu nationalists to finally turn on Trump. But,
did they?
Yeah. I don't know. I didn't check. I'm hoping they did, but
it wasn't big enough if they did.
Yeah. I think he actually issued another tweet where he actually included Hindus.
Oh, did he? Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, actually, there were two tweets without Hindus. It's really funny because it's like, why would you tweet a second time and still not include them? But
yeah, he's like, congratulations, this is a holiday, something like that. What was it, Buddhists and Jains?
Yeah, everyone except Hindus.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you? I don't know. How do you mess up that bad? But yeah. Anyway, Diwali is this really popular festival. Celebrated in most parts of India. Fireworks are a big part of it. Basically, given the population, given how bad the pollution and stuff already is, the quality of air and all of that, I think the government is trying to impose some restrictions on fireworks. And even if not the government, there's just like activists, environmental activists, leftists, and like we're trying to point out that,
you mean?
Right, postmodernists. Well, actually, the Hindu nationalist equivalent of that is, I've noticed they have their own term. It's Christ-Islamo-Kami. So it's like a conjunction of all the different ideologies that they're.
It's what? Islamo-Kami?
No, Christ-Islamo Kami. So Christian, Islamic, communist, all of that rolled into one. These are like the three forces threatening Hindu hegemony. So we'll just roll them all together.
I'm surprised they didn't include the secularists as well.
Well, I think that falls under Kami.
Oh, so, right. Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Christ-Lamo commies are trying to restrict fireworks, and that's an
Right.
evil...
That's the war on Diwali. And it's not just they're constantly, there's a sense of victimhood, and which is, again, is classic sort of part of far right ideology in general, is when you're obviously the dominant group, you keep acting, or you keep projecting the sense of being under siege by vague threats that can't really be defined in any real sense. So you have to invent these ideas like cultural Marxism or Christ-Lamo commies or whatever.
And also you decry victimhood culture at the same time.
Right. When actual victims of violence complain about being victims, that's just them being soft victims. But when the dominant group, who's really under no threat, complains about non-issues, that's totally legitimate. They're just they're just using their voice. Yeah,
it's like, do you guys have a Indian version of Quillette that has all these takes for how poor Hindu upper caste men are being screwed over?
I'm sure there's quite a few. There's one of the more popular ones is called Swarajya, and they're like the online Hindu nationalist, like the center of all their propaganda. And they're like a mix. They have some of the people who write there are belong to the sophisticated class of people that I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. Some of them are a lot less sophisticated, but it's like a mix of all these people. And it's like it's what every sort of young aspiring Hindu nationalist has to be. That's what they're reading if they want to be on top of their game. Yeah.
And there's a lot of Trump support, right? There's a lot of Indian American Trump support, and
anyone who hates Muslims is our friend. So
nice.
Yeah. Although I think I'm not sure. I didn't look at the actual statistics of they'd done some polling on who Indian Americans as a whole voted for, and I know it was still overwhelmingly Democrat, but I'm not sure what the exact percentages were there. So
yeah, but surprisingly, there's still a significant number of Trump supporters.
Oh yeah, there's an actual group called Hindus for Trump.
Cute. There's a Muslims for Trump, so why not?
No, really, yeah. I'm not surprised by anything at this point. So.
I know. 2016 onwards has been very, very, very strange.
Yeah, there's going to be an illegal immigrants for Trump next. I can't it's so absurd, the kinds of alliances we're seeing, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, it's a strange world now. People are just, I guess, joining hands based on who or what they hate most.
Right. Yeah. As long as there's some sort of common enemy, that's all they need.
Yeah, Islamist MRAs clearly hate women more than white supremacists.
Yeah.
So they're fine tweeting out white supremacist pieces and shit.
Aren't there some people who actually consider themselves white too? Or some I don't know, some Arab Islamist people who think they're basically white? Or I may be mixing that up with someone else.
Yeah, there's one guy that I've heard of that's an Egyptian white nationalist YouTuber, but I haven't seen enough of it to consider it a group. It may very well be.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Isn't there some sort of Aryan thing among Indians as well, right?
Yeah, it's weird because the actual Sanskrit word, it just initially just meant something like noble. So it was like an ethnocentric term, right? So pretty much every culture had there's us and then there's the barbarians. So that was the sense in which the term was used. It was just us, people who, follow our customs and have the similar languages. There's us and then there's the barbarians.
And there was no caste element, of skin color?
There probably was, but I don't think that term Arya itself was actually related to skin color directly. Because you can see brown Indians look on white Europeans as barbarians, basically. They're not considered, the white Europeans are not considered Aryan. They're the outsider, they're barbarians. So it's much more of a sort of ethnic and cultural thing than, so if you look at medieval and early modern texts of how they portray Europeans, it's not flattering in the slightest. They're basically unwashed, filthy barbarians. So it's not, and again, they didn't really have a race, the concept of race back then. Skin color based prejudice, definitely did exist. And it's existed in most cultures as far as I can see, or at least a lot of cultures. But again, the word didn't have this racial connotation to it, which it now does. The interesting thing is that the more internet savvy 4chan type Hindu nationalists are the ones who actually...
That's a thing.
Yeah, it's pathetic. But they're the guys who actually go with the more explicitly racial talking points of the Western far right. So for them, it's not just a cultural thing. So they'll talk about things like race and IQ, right? They'll talk about that a lot. And
will Sam Harris.
Right. And these people have turned it back into a sort of racial term again. So you'll see like the 4chan equivalent of Hindu nationalists talk to each other and call each other Aryans and stuff like that. It's bizarre, but it is a thing, yeah.
And what's weird is that here in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, there's school regions, and there's one where there's a lot of, Pakistani, Indian, so the Muslim population is high in one school board region. And there's been controversy about the sex ed curriculum, which fair enough, religious parents didn't want their kids learning about progressive sex ed and consent and things like that. And so there were a lot of Muslim parents that were outraged about it and kept their kids home from school, completely, I think, justified to oppose them on that. And then there's this other issue of Friday prayers in schools, right, which in that region, I guess, has been a long-standing thing that just happens. But now there's a bunch of Hindu right-wing activists that have come together with these Western right-wing activists to oppose the Muslims, and they talk about things like, we don't want to see our society crumbling under an Islamic onslaught, and immigrants to Canada themselves are in the article she's described as, she bristles at being identified as Indian and believe others should have the same mentality. You came to Canada, assimilate here, she says, her voice growing raw. And it's this other activist dude who has no kids who go to this school district. He says he has no ill feelings about Islam. In fact, he once had a surgeon who was a Muslim, his wife, as is his wife's hairdresser and his son's best friend. How could anyone call him anti-Muslim? Yeah, it's like the one or two Muslims you've encountered in your life. It's just simply a question of principle for him. If public is funding schools, then they must be kept secular, which, I technically agree with, but Ontario, our province, funds an entire Catholic school board. So if this principle is to be applied evenly, then it's not just about Jummah prayer or Friday prayer in some schools. It should be the entirely funded board that should be opposed, in my opinion, first, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're really committed to secularism, then that's the position, that's the consistent position. But of course, they're not.
It's just anti-Islam.
Yeah. Then I've seen them do weird stuff where they say, well, it's Catholicism and Christianity in the West. It's not really a religious thing. It's just part of our cultural heritage. So it's not really a violation of secularism. Whereas Islam, of course, is something completely foreign and alien. It is.
They have religion classes. They have prayers. Right. And where do you think the Islamist parents, if not given a choice to, if they struggle sending to private Islamic school, that's their top choice, is a Catholic board school, because they have the conservative, homophobic, anti-choice, anti-sex values.
Yeah.
So...
And you said that there's a whole bunch of Hindus who are in on this whole movement as well.
Yeah.
I've noticed a similar thing with a lot of Hindus who are constantly appear on Tommy Robinson's stuff and boost him a lot.
As a shield for being called racist, right?
Right. And their whole thing is the same thing as, we're scared that, we've assimilated here, but the Muslims are not, and we're scared that we're going to have Sharia here. So, we stand with Tommy Robinson and that whole thing.
That's exactly it. And it's terrifying to see minorities throw other minorities under the bus like that. I am, for the record, not really keen on prayers in school at all, especially when they're segregated by gender, especially when it's assumed that the women, the girls will be praying behind the boys, which I assume is what happens. But I don't see it as like, we better stop this now or it's Sharia. Sharia has taken over, and the Catholic school board can do whatever it wants. Meanwhile,
right? It's a strange sort of Sharia, but
it's like proportionality on these things really, isn't there.
In a way, I guess it's not surprising. It's just it's a minority doing, to get ahead itself, allies with the dominant group against another minority. It thinks that's a way that's a way to gain upward mobility.
So much of this
really what it is
about power balances and imbalances, right? It's something that people in the atheist movement often do not understand or have a very literalist reading of, right? So if you say something horrible about a black person, it's literally exactly the same as saying something white people, when it's not, because of the context, the history, the power balances and imbalances. And so a lot of these disagreements are based on those, I find.
Yeah, and it's come to the point where I've heard people say, just saying white people is a slur.
Oh, yeah. There's a far-right atheist guy who was, I retweeted something about him being a white guy, like trying to explain something to me, and he said I was retweeting racial slurs against him. And this guy defends Milo and all kinds of gross far right people. But just calling him a white guy is a racial slur.
I mean, what can I say?
But so some interesting overlaps going on between the Indian far right. Well, I say Hindu far right because there's a couple of Indian far rights. I'm sure there's an Islamic Indian far right as well.
There's no shortage of reactionary movements in India,
right.
So you can you don't have to worry about not being inclusive.
No, I just wanted to be specific. Right. So I think we covered some good ground for basic understanding.
Yeah, I think we've touched on most of the important issues. But now all we have to do is wait and watch the Hindu nationalist horde descend.
Yay! Before I let you go, let's quickly talk about beef. We said we would talk about it. Oh, yes,
we didn't talk about beef.
Yeah. So I want to know your thoughts, as a vegan and as a non-religious vegan. You're not coming at it from any religious
Hey, veganism is my religion.
Yeah, kind of, I bet. But it must be strange to see that hijacked by far-right bigots who are violent, murdering, lynching people, all in the name of, so-called no violence towards animals.
Right. It's an interesting difference. The associations people have when they think of vegetarianism or even, veganism is not really much of a thing in India. Well, it's growing, but it's still not really well known, unlike vegetarianism. But so in the West, being a vegetarian or a vegan is associated with a kind of, it's like a hippie thing or a general sort of progressive left-wing counterculture type of thing. But it's the opposite.
There are some fashy vegans out there.
Right. But, on average, in general, that's kind of what people associate vegetarianism with. But it's the exact opposite in India, right? So in India, being vegetarian is associated with, conservatism and, traditionalism and, upper caste orthodoxy. That's what people think vegetarianism is. And, it is, that's not an incorrect evaluation.
Right. There are people who won't rent apartments to people who eat meat. People who will issue rape threats to people who eat meat. People who won't sit at the same table, drink out of the same, glasses that those people use, things like that, right?
Right, that's because it's much more. It's not just out of an ethical concern for animals. It's this whole notion of ritual and bodily impurity that's associated with meat consumption, and that's and again that has ties to other things like caste. So traditionally the castes that people associate with acts that involve so for example butchers or leather workers and castes like that work with animals and dead animals are considered entirely ritually impure. And it's actually not just a Hindu thing; it's a thing in Buddhism as well. So in like places like Korea, Japan, Tibet, you have like outcasts or so-called untouchable groups who are mostly in these kinds of professions. And it's the same is true of South Asia as well. So there's this association with people who deal with dead animals on a regular basis, and also people who consume meat. All of that is ritually impure, and being in the presence of meat or being in the presence of people who eat meat, all of that is considered defiling to your spiritual or ritual purity. So you want to stay as far away from that as possible.
Which is another weird supremacist element, right?
Right. It's just a caste supremacist thing.
Yeah.
And it's the high caste mostly, although not entirely. Mostly the Brahmin caste that has this sort of view. But the point is that that's what vegetarianism is in India. It's not this sort of hippie concern for animals. And most vegetarians in India, are not vegetarian by choice in the sense that they think about, animal cruelty and animal rights and they come to that conclusion. They're just kind of raised vegetarian and they grow up vegetarian. In fact, it's interesting because a lot of my Indian friends grew up vegetarian. And then in their in their teens, they started eating meat as a sign of rebellion against, their parents, against conservatism, against tradition. Whereas I kind of went in the opposite direction. I actually, my family, we'd eat meat pretty often. So that wasn't something, we never had a problem with that. But I eventually stopped eating meat. So it's just interesting that there was that these different trajectories.
Did yours start with rebellion or?
Did I stop eating meat as a form of rebellion? No, I just started looking into literature on animal rights and stuff like that, and eventually gave it up. But I recognize that vegetarianism and veganism mean different things in India, and that puts me in kind of a weird spot.
Yeah.
Especially because it's true that.
So Jordan Peterson's all beef diet is a big no-no, huh? I'm just
he should spend some time in India. See how people react to that.
Yeah, really.
But again, it's worth noting that the vast majority of Indians do eat meat. It's vegetarianism is restricted to a few elite castes and groups of people. Again, if I talk about meat and being vegan a lot, that's going to be seen as giving cover to these caste supremacist points of view, and especially with things like beef, there's the additional religious element to it as well, right?
Yeah.
Again, this whole cow protection thing is just another way of establishing your dominance over a religious minority, Muslims in this case. Yeah. Mostly, predominantly.
And oftentimes the accusations of cow slaughter are like false, I've also read, the blasphemy accusations in Pakistan. Exactly.
Yeah, it's just a pretext to whip up a sort of mob that goes after these people. So again, it puts me in a weird spot because the protests, the response to that has involved public beef, where we have this event where we all eat beef in public as a form of protest. So strange. And the people doing this are people I consider allies, and any other event I'd be there. It's just I'm not sure what to do in these cases where I have my own view on these things that I can't. So I just I just don't, maybe a bit of a cop out, but I just generally don't talk about that whole subject because I know it's not going to end well.
Yeah, and it just must be so conflicting and weird inside. It's kind of like how I feel about talking about Islam now. I mean, I still talk about it a bit, but it's like, the people who are like the loudest critics are so fucking awful. Yet I do think this thing deserves to be criticized.
Right. But one thing I do point out is the obvious like hypocrisy of Hindu nationalists in this case, where if they really did care about cows, then they'd be entirely vegan, right? Because the dairy industry in India, just like dairy industry everywhere else, is atrocious. Just the way they actually treat cows is, if you actually watch footage of what it's like, it's it's not something you're going to be able to watch. So if that's really what was motivating them, then they'd
like
be
the halal anti-halal activism,
right? Exactly, right. Yep.
Tommy Robinson and stuff are like, I'm like, okay, so Tommy, are you vegetarian? No. Right. Okay, so you can kill and eat a cow, but you're just against other people doing that of course there are some there are ethical concerns and I guess to do with the method of slaughter and stuff like that, but I think ultimately if you're murdering and eating something, it kind of, you do not have the higher ground anymore.
Yeah, and the idea that like traditional like Western non-halal forms of slaughter are like this humane, completely bloodless affair is ridiculous. Again, all you have to do is actually look at, watch some of the footage, and it's horrifying. Yeah. It's kind of similar to the way people react to like that. There's that dog meat festival in China, right, where they talk about, it's barbaric the way they treat these dogs. But it's really not that different from the way
okay, now we're going into real vegan territory.
Well, no, I'm just trying to point out that people aren't really thinking in terms of concern, because what they're trying to do is there's this other that they're trying to establish dominance over another, and they're just using this as a pretext, which is really what it is, whether it's cow slaughter or whether it's halal or whatever it is.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I mean, I'm not a big meat eater myself. Like, I hate meat. I find it gross most of the time, unless I can eat it in a form where it doesn't remind me of what it is. So, but I don't commit to being a vegetarian either. I barely eat meat, but yeah.
Just take the plunge, join the dark side.
I probably just attracted a whole other group of people to me. I mean, I've received emails from vegans saying that I'm like a slave owner. So you're not one of those. You're a nice vegan. You don't ever get super aggressive with me, even though I don't eat meat.
Yeah, I'm wondering if if we're going to attract like angry meat eaters now that I've said stuff about veganism. That would be interesting to watch.
They're more douchey, aren't they? Like, more douchey than anything. Like, like I'm just going to eat 16 steaks now to piss you off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh dear.
I'm destroying my health to own the vegans, basically. Yeah.
Well, is it maybe that's what Jordan Peterson's all beef diet is rooted in?
Yeah, it's just a consistent
own the SJWs.
Yeah, his whole he's crazy. He's like super anti. Of course, like he's anti any progressive thing. He's anti animal rights activist as well. So I think so maybe his whole all beef diet is just like an extended protest against animal rights activists. Yeah,
he claimed stopping eating greens made him stop snoring. That's such bullshit.
That's extremely, extremely scientific. I mean, I don't see any issues there.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've attracted a few groups towards this chat, and you're not going to be tagged into it.
Yeah, I'm just going to let you deal with the fallout.
Right. I'll let you know which is worse.
Yeah. My money is still on Hindu nationalists are going to be you'll recognize that they're the worst. But
okay, we'll see. All right. Okay. Well, thanks again, Ravi, for joining. It was an interesting talk. Okay. Take care.
Yeah. You too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon, patreon.com/nicemangoes. No Ian Mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @nicemangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal, nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no Ian Mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too.